So this is part 3. Please got the final installment, right? Pirkei Mishnah Hey, 5th chapter, 5th Mishnah. Miracles that happened. We've done 8 out of 10 miracles. We've got 2 for today. Should be able to manage that, I think. Yeah, should be able to manage 2. But before we begin, just remember that right at the beginning of the Mishnah, I raised a question. We're going to see that question today. Right at the beginning of the Mishnah, the question I asked you was, the Mishnah starts by telling us that there were 10 miracles where? In the Beis HaMikdash. The 2 that we're going to learn today did not happen in the Beis HaMikdash. So the question was, if you say there are 10 miracles in the Beis HaMikdash, how is it possible then that the last 2 of them are not in the Beis HaMikdash? They're in the city of Yerushalayim. So we're going to have to explore that in the course of what we learn over here today. So what are the 2 miracles that we're going to learn today? The first is Lo hizik nachash ve'akra b'Yerushalayim mei oilam, that there was never somebody who harmed by a snake or by a scorpion ever in Yerushalayim. It's only one of 2 occurrences in this Mishnah where it uses the word mei oilam, that it never happened that somebody was harmed by a snake or by a scorpion in Yerushalayim. That's number 1. And number 2 is Veloi Omar Adam Lachaveroi, no person said to his friend, Tsar li hamokoim, the place is too narrow. Those words are Tsar li hamokoim. Those words are from the book of Yeshaya. So no person said to the other person, Tsar li hamokoim, the place is too congested. She'alin b'Yerushalayim, that I would stay over in Yerushalayim. Okay, so both of those are specifically things that happen not in the Beis HaMikdash itself, but in Yerushalayim. We have to understand why. We also, let's ask a few other questions. Why don't we say nobody was ever harmed by any creature in Yerushalayim? Why snakes and scorpions? Surely there were other, you have to remember, it's not like today where Yerushalayim is this ultra-modern city and it's got the light rail and it's built up and it's urbanized. Yerushalayim then, in those days, was wild country, except for the little city of Yerushalayim. And there were all kinds of creatures that frequented that part of the world, not only snakes and scorpions. So why is that the big one? Okay, that's the one question. Why does it say me oilam, ever? I mean, you tell me that there's nobody was harmed by a snake or scorpion. Because it's a hate. Why do you have to say me oilam? It never happened. Why that emphasis? Next question. What does it mean that the miracle is? Please explain to me. What is the last? Let's play it differently. What is the last miracle on the list? That what? There was room for everybody in Yerushalayim, which obviously means those special times of the year where people had to come en masse, and suddenly this little town is completely overridden. Like if you've ever been to Meron, around Lag Boimer, like you go outside of Lag Boimer, Meron is a little town. You go on Lag Boimer, you wonder where on earth they put all these people. So that's the miracle. Yes? Does everybody agree that's the miracle? The miracle is that there was no lack of accommodation, no lack of space in Yerushalayim. Okay, if that's the miracle, why does the Mishnah say that no person said to their friend that the place is too congested? Why don't you just say simply, there was enough room? Right?
Each person individually felt like there was room for them.
Each person individually felt like there was room for them. Okay, so I'm asking again, is the miracle that there was room, or is the miracle that they felt that there was room? It's 2 different things. 2 different things. There you go. Now that's true insight into the Jewish community. The fact that they didn't complain, that's the miracle. Right? Yes? Because we know what it's like to deal with the Jewish community, right? What do you mean they didn't complain? Have you read the Torah? Have you read the Tanakh? The Jews complain. It's what we do. So maybe that's the miracle. The miracle is that they didn't complain. Okay? So if that is the case, why does it specify Veloi Amar Adam Lachaveroi? No person said to their friend. Could just say, no person complained. Why is it relevant for us to know that they didn't complain to their friend?
That's what we tend to complain. complain to.
Of course, that's what we tend to do. Of course, we tend to complain to our friends. Sure. But if it's that obvious, you don't have to say it. Just say, nobody complained. Why do we have to know they complained? They didn't complain to their friend. Maybe, what's that? Lashon Hara about the city. Right, speaking badly about the city, that's a good point. Now, the reality is, maybe you have to be careful also, because when it says, when the Mishnah is very precise language, so if it says nobody spoke to their friend, maybe they spoke to somebody else. Maybe there was an official board in charge of accommodation in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Tourism Board. Maybe that's who they complained to. So why does it us, right? Okay, so those are the questions that we have to ask, and that's what we're going to look at. And of course, the question that we have to take out of all of this is, what's the lesson for us? There have to be lessons for us in both of these examples. This is Pirkei Avos. It's not a book of history. It's not a book of halacha. It's a book of lessons, moral lessons for our lives. So we have to understand what are the lessons to take. So let's start off with the snakes and the scorpions. Remember last week we spoke about snakes and scorpions as well, right? Where did we speak about it last week? We had Yosef, who was thrown into a pit by his brothers. And the Torah tells us, "V'haboy reik," the pit was empty. "Ein boy mayim," it had no water. Okay, so clearly it was not a pothole in Johannesburg. This one had no water in it. So, by the way, I don't know if anybody's realized, just an aside, this is the local council's solution to all of Joburg's problems, because we constantly have leaks, so we lose water, so they have potholes to collect other water to replace the water that we lose in the leaking pipes. The genius is astounding. So anyway, so what do we learn? It says, "Ein boy mayim," that the pit that Joseph was thrown into had no water. So Rashi understands, "Ein boy mayim," the Torah is telling us that there was obviously something else. "Nechoshim ba'akravim yesh boy," that it had snakes and scorpions. Now, at face value, that is because that's the region. That part of the world is a place that has snakes and scorpions. It's arid. It's the kind of place where it breeds those creatures. Snakes and scorpions are common to that part of the world, to the more desert-like parts of the world. So the idea is that you anticipate a place that is not urbanized in that region is going to have snakes and scorpions. That's what you expect. However, when we spoke about this, we said that water is metaphoric of the Torah, and snakes and scorpions are metaphoric for the things that get into a person's mind. The so-called pit in the story is a representation of the human mind. When the mind is not filled with Torah, with water, with healthy things, it will naturally be filled with unhealthy things, snakes and scorpions. And so initially, the very first thing that we recognize when we look at this Mishnah is there's a message. The message is, if you are in the right environment, represented by the Beis HaMikdash, and even extended beyond that by Yerushalayim, if you're in the right environment, you are immune to the snakes and scorpions. That's the first level of the message that we're learning over here. It's immunity to the snakes and scorpions. So hang out in a good place, hang out in a healthy place, and you will be protected. Okay, fine. But we've got to understand, well, what are snakes and what are scorpions and what does it all mean? So the Gemara tells us in Brochos very famously that there are certain times during davening where we are not allowed to move. So let's say when you say the Shema, you're allowed to move, but you're not allowed to react to somebody. So if somebody greets you while you're saying the Shema, it's inappropriate to greet them in response, unless it's somebody who you're afraid of, right? Then you can greet the person. If it's somebody who, God forbid, might threaten your life, then you can greet them. The Shemoneh Esrei, the Amidah, is different. When a person's standing during the Amidah, Zehu, you're not allowed to move. Doesn't matter who. Very famous story the Gemara tells about one of the great Tanoim who was standing. He was davening, and a Roman, whatever he was, an official, a military man comes past. He greets him. He doesn't respond, and eventually the guy's ready to kill him. By the time he finishes Shemoneh Esrei, and he says, "Would you respond if you were speaking to your emperor?" So then he had respect for it, and he said, "Okay, fine. What you did was appropriate." So now here's the question. Question which we don't have to worry about, of course, living in Joburg. Thank God we don't have to worry about snakes and scorpions, only tigers. But let's say this could happen, you were davening out in nature in the Kruger Park, which at the moment, unfortunately, you can't get to, right? This guy from Ashul arrives at Chakras this morning. He says it took him 10 hours to get home from the Kruger, and they left a day early because they were afraid they wouldn't get out. I said, I don't understand you. If I was stuck in the Kruger, I'd say I'm stuck in the Kruger. What are you running back to work for? I mean, what do you need? Anyway, so let's say a person is davening Shemona Esrei. You're not allowed to move. You're standing with their feet together, you're not allowed to move. Says the Gemara, if a person's davening the Shemona Esrei and a snake arrives at their feet, what's the halacha? The halacha is you don't move. You don't move. But if a scorpion arrives, then you move. Okay, now let's analyze this firstly from a purely pragmatic perspective and then from a spiritual perspective. Realistically, forget it's Shemona Esrei. It's not Shemona Esrei. You're hiking out in the bush and you come face to face with a snake. What do they advise you to do? Stay still. Has anybody ever had that experience? It's a nice theory. Quite a number of years ago, I took my kids to a place called Groenkloof. You might have been there, in Pretoria. And we went for a little hike. Our hike lasted 7 minutes. 5 minutes in, 2 minutes out. Why? Because literally, if I'm not exaggerating, 5 minutes into the hike, we ran into a Cape Cobra. Right there, first time in my life I've ever encountered a snake face to face, and it was standing up with a hood and the whole business. So what do you think I thought of the Gemara? You think I thought of what you're supposed to? No, we ran. That's what we did. Are you supposed to? No, you're not supposed to. That's exactly what I tell you not to do. Why not? Because you'll never outrun a snake. If a snake intends to attack, you cannot move faster than the snake. That's the reality. So the safest thing to do is to stay still, so you indicate that you're not a threat, and the snake will hopefully move on.
Also their vision, they can't see in a direct line.
But I think they pick up on vibrations, right?
Yeah.
Snakes pick up on the vibrations. So if you're moving, it's conscious of the fact that you're there. Okay. Right, so there you go. Great. So we have all now learned the most practical thing that none of us will do. I can tell you from first-hand experience. It's all nice in theory and in practice. It's not how you behave. Now a scorpion doesn't care. Scorpion doesn't distinguish between a threat or no threat. A snake won't attack you if it doesn't feel threatened. The scorpion doesn't distinguish. So the scorpion will sting another being regardless of whether it poses a threat or not. And practically, you can certainly outrun a scorpion. That's for sure. So the halacha is, if a scorpion comes, you run. Okay, now you know. Please God, you never have to apply it in practice. Now let's dig deeper. That's the practical reason. What do you think the Gemara is telling us in spiritual terms? Let's think for a moment. First of all, the first time we ever encounter a snake in history is Adam and Eve, right? It's the first time we encounter a snake. So we know that the snake is always associated with being tempted to do something wrong. That's what a snake is. And that's what everybody thinks of. When they think of a snake, they think of temptation, because the snake is the original tempter. But you know what we forget? We forget what Hashem says about the snake. That's the practicality of how the snake began its career. What does Hashem say about the snake? But what does he say about him? What does he say about the snake? He says about the snake, Ve'eva ashis beincha uvein ha'isha. I will make a permanent hatred between you and the woman and all of her descendants throughout history. For which reason, the commentaries on our Mishnah, a number of the different Mefarshim, will tell us that the snake represents hatred. What we call sinas chinam, right? Hatred of other people. One of the most dangerous things, God forbid, that could ever happen to us, just like a snake is dangerous, and could, God forbid, lead to a person losing their lives. Hatred and division, Ava, the division between people, is one of the most dangerous things that could happen to our nation. So the first lesson is, if you want to avoid hatred, you've got to be in the Beis Hamikdash or its surrounds. You've got to be in a holy environment. You've got to be focused on something which is positive. Now, in a moment, we're going to define what Yerushalayim means, because here the story is not limited to the Beis Hamikdash. It actually happens in the whole city of Yerushalayim. So we're going to look at the city of Yerushalayim and understand what it means. But before we get there, let's understand better what a snake and a scorpion is. So this is what it says. Nachash arsoi chom. The venom of a snake is hot. It burns. The person who's bitten by a snake, it burns. Arsoi shel akrov kor. The venom of a scorpion is cold, which I would assume means that it numbs the area. Okay? What's the distinction between the two? So what's most dangerous in life? Is it most dangerous to get all worked up? Or is it most dangerous to be indifferent? The famous line of Elie Wiesel, what's a paragraph of Elie Wiesel, where he says that the opposite of love is not hatred, it is indifference. And he gives a whole lot of different examples. The opposite of being alive is to be indifferent. What does that mean? So we'll use an example. Who's the archenemy of the Jewish people? Amalek, right? Amalek is the archenemy of the Jewish people. When Amalek comes to attack the Jewish people, the Torah tells us we must remember and never forget what they did. What does the Torah say they did? Asher koracha baderech. Now, the literal translation, Asher koracha, is they ambushed you on the way. But Rashi says, what does koracha mean? It's a mashal of a very hot bath. And everybody was too afraid to get into the water because they were afraid that the water would burn them. Until you got one guy who came along and he jumped into the water and he cooled the water in everybody else's perception. Koracha. He cooled off enthusiasm. That is the arch enemy of the Jewish people, is an attitude of indifference. Because to be Jewish, you've got to be lebedig. You've got to be enthusiastic. You've got to be passionate. We have to have love of Hashem, right? Love is a passionate experience. So what's the antithesis of Judaism? Indifference. So the snake and the scorpion represent two different toxic mindsets. Remember, the bor, the pit that we described with Yosef, is representative of the mind. The water that belongs in the pit represents Torah. When there's no water, we said there'll be snakes and scorpions, and now we're unpacking what the toxic nature of a snake and of a scorpion is. So the snake has a hot venom. What does that represent? One of two things. Either, because we've just said that the snake is Eva Ashis, the snake represents diversity and discord and conflict. So what kind of a conflict is the snake? A very passionate conflict. That's a conflict where people are fighting outright. It's what we call a hot war. I don't know if I ever told you the story, but a number of years ago, we had a group of Israelis at our house. It's a whole story how they landed up over there, but they landed at our house for a meal, and they were a group of people who hadn't met previously. They came to South Africa on a group together, but they didn't know each other from before. Unfortunately, the lift that was supposed to pick them up at the end of the meal ran like an hour late. They've got a whole lot of Israelis sitting in a room, and they're getting to know each other, and as they're getting to know each other, they discover that they are on the far ends of the religious spectrum. So we had some frum people in the group, and then we had some people who were kind of parav, and then we had a few people who were from the real left, secular, anti-religious part of Israel. And before we knew it, there was this eruption between the groups. And the one particular group, these very left-wing secular Israelis, were very outspoken. They didn't believe in God. They didn't believe that there's such a thing as a Jewish identity. It's purely cultural. It was very heated, very, very heated. And, in an Israeli crowd, they got heated. They were screaming and shouting, all the kinds of things going on. The next morning, I'm taking my kids to school, right here, just up the road. And we run into heavy traffic inching along. Eventually we see what's going on. There was a minor car accident. Who was in the one car? That was it. Those Israelis from not the Frum guys, not the Parav guys, the anti-religion guys. They were in this car accident. Baruch Hashem, nobody was hurt. I pull over to the side, jump out of my car, just check on them, see everything's okay, somebody picking you up, you don't have any injuries, whatever, no problem. I said, you have to excuse me, I've got to get my kids to school. So I turn around and start walking back to the car, and they shout after me, Rabbi, titpalel b'shvelenu bebet hakneset. Daven for us when you get to shul. And I'm like, okay. See, that's the thing. When there is hot venom, when there is passion, even if it's misguided and misdirected, it's actually not so difficult to redirect because there's passion. So the person who previously was so outspoken in their anti-Jewish views is now passionately, I'm not saying that they became religious the next day, but the passion is redirected. That's the nachash, that's the snake. The snake represents when a person has a thought process that comes into their mind, either of discord with a fellow Jew or discord with their own Judaism, but it's passionate. I'm excited about something else. Versus the scorpion. The scorpion is indifference. And I'm sure you know the well-used line, what is the difference between apathy and ignorance? And the answer is, I don't know and I don't care. In other words, what it's telling us is, if I don't care, I'll never know. So the only thing that's worse than outright conflict is indifference. Let's put it this way. I don't know if anybody here has any experience doing marriage counseling. But if you do, the one thing you don't enjoy is having a couple sitting in marriage counseling fighting like cat and dog. It's terrible. But you know what's worse? When they don't fight. That's worse. Complete indifference, because then you know there's nothing left. There's nobody, there's no relationship. At least if there's a conflict, there's a relationship. Therefore, the Gemara says, if you're davening the Shemona Esrei, present company obviously excluded. In the middle of the Shemona Esrei, an inappropriate thought comes into your head. You might not know, this happens to some people. So an inappropriate thought comes into a person's head. Says the Gemara, you've got to identify which kind of a thought is it. Is it a snake thought or is it a scorpion thought? What's the difference between a snake and a scorpion thought? A snake thought is something like this. You're busy davening, and the next thing you think, oh, I cannot wait until after davening, because then I'm going to go X. You fill in the blanks, right? You could make it as simple and kosher as I'm going to go have a good coffee, or you can make it whatever, I'm going to go watch Netflix. I don't know, whatever it is. But, it's like I suddenly get excited. As soon as I can get out of this davening, I'm going to be able to do something that makes me happy. Is it an appropriate thought? Completely inappropriate. Persons in the middle of davening, they think, I can't believe so-and-so came to stand right next to me while I'm davening. They don't ever keep quiet during I'm trying to daven with all the kavanah, and here's this person who comes and they jabber away next to me. These are what we call snake thoughts. They get us excited. You can feel that suddenly we're enthusiastic. Suddenly the blood pressure goes up. Says the Gemara, don't run. Don't run. Could be that the davening was a little bit fashlofen, but half asleep, and now something woke you up. Take the energy and plug it into the davening. The energy is good. What's producing the energy is bad. You've got to get rid of that. But the energy is good. So don't run from the snake. Use the snake. Use the excitement and redirect it. But if a person is davening and what comes along a scorpion, what does a scorpion thought sound like? What's the point of my davening? What's the point of it? I never concentrate anyway. I'm so easily distracted. I'm wasting my time over here. Hashem's never going to listen to me. Any kind of thinking that creates indifference, in other words, that's going to cool off my enthusiasm, like Amalek jumping into the hot bath and going to suck the life out of my davening, that's when you've got to run for the hills. That's the most dangerous thing that can happen in the course of davening, or by extension in the course of our spirituality. The miracle of the Beis Hamikdash is when there was a Beis Hamikdash, nobody was harmed. It doesn't mean that nobody ever had inappropriate thoughts. Nobody was harmed by either the snake-like or the scorpion-like thoughts. That's the greatness of the Beis Hamikdash. Practically as well, by the way, because practically we know, for example, that, again, in those days, much of Yerushalayim was not paved. And so the fact is that scorpions and snakes were common and nobody was harmed. So there's a physical side to this too. But the lesson for us is not, oh, Yerushalayim is a safe place from snakes and scorpions. The lesson for us is we have to be in a spiritual state of Yerushalayim, and that will protect us from ever being harmed by our inappropriate thoughts. So now you've got to ask yourself, what is a spiritual state of Yerushalayim? So the simple answer you could say is when there's a Beis Hamikdash radiates such incredible intensity that it spills over into the whole city, and the whole city is an amazing place, and you're there and you're in the aura. But there's got to be a deeper meaning to this as well. So let's take the word Yerushalayim and ask ourselves, how did the Yerushalayim get its name? Anybody remember, how did Yerushalayim get its name?
Yerushalayim.
Okay, what was its name originally? The original name of the city was Sholem. Not Shalom, Sholem. What does Sholem mean? Complete. How do we know that's the original name of the city? Because after Avraham comes back from defeating the kings who attacked Sodom, so who came to visit him? Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem. Malki Tzedek, the king of, remember in those days you could be the king over a city, the king of Sholem. How did it change from Sholem to Yerushalayim? What changed it? So let's, again with Avraham Avinu, what famous story with Avraham Avinu happened in that part of the world? The Akedah. Where was the Akedah? On the mountain, right? Bahar Hashem Yeroeh. The mountain on which Hashem appears. Right? So because this is the epicenter of Yerushalayim, is this mountain, what we call Har HaMoriah, or Har HaBayis, so because that was called the mountain Asher Hashem Yeroeh, the mountain where Hashem will be seen, so that gave it the name Yeroeh, and Shalem together became Yerushalayim. So Chazal tell us that Yerushalayim represents Yir'ah Shleima, a state of complete fear of God. That's what Yerushalayim represents. Now you could take that and plug it into every place where we speak about Yerushalayim in any of our literature, and understand that it's not only a geographical location, but it is equally a spiritual state. Interesting, right? Yerushalayim ircha berachamim toshuv. Do we want Hashem to take us back to Jerusalem when Mashiach comes? Yes. Do we want Jerusalem just to be the geographical capital of the Jewish nation? Of course not. We want Yerushalayim in terms of what it represents. Yir'ah Shalema, complete fear of Hashem. Okay, what is complete fear of Hashem? Maybe one of the most elusive topics that we speak about in Judaism is fear of God. What does fear of God look like? Anybody have an illustration? What does fear of God look like? How do you know that you have Yirah Shamayim? That you fear God? How do you know? That what?
In private.
In private. But what does it look like? Oh, right. So you're saying you behave in a certain way in private because you know it's not about what other people see, it's what Hashem sees. As Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai famously told his disciples before he passed away. What does it feel like?
You feel a disconnection. You feel the fear of being disconnected.
So there you go. Excellent. Excellent. So what is Yirah Shamayim? I'm afraid that if I do something against what Hashem wants, it will disconnect me from Him. Chas v'shalom. That's the fear. So in Kabbalah and in the teachings of Hasidus, we distinguish between two kinds of Yirah. It's called Yirah Tata'ah and Yirah Ila'ah, which means the entry-level Yirah and the supernal Yirah. The entry-level yira is exactly that, and I'm afraid of the consequences to my relationship with Hashem if I don't behave, because every mitzvah connects a person, every avera chas v'shalom disconnects a person, so there's a fear of disconnect. That is yira tata'a, entry-level yira. That's not yet yira shleima. So what's yira shleima? So the word fear is the misleading part of all of this. Okay, the word fear makes exactly. Awe is a far stronger word. So let's put it this way. Let's say that there was an individual who to you is the most powerful individual you could ever want to meet in your life. So there must be somebody out there who to you is like the greatest gadol, the greatest Talmid Chacham, the greatest tzaddik that you could ever meet. Okay, now you get the opportunity to meet them. So you're standing outside, you're next in line to meet them. Do you have yira? Yeah. Are you scared? It's not scared. It's not scared like what's going to happen. You're completely in awe. And then when you actually meet them, what happens? You're so in awe of them. Whatever you thought you were going to do, whatever you thought you were going to say, it's irrelevant, because you know what happens when you're in the presence of greatness? You disappear. Everybody thinks I'm going to come with my script and have all the things I'm going to say and all the things I'm going to ask for, and I'm going to give my little insight and whatever the case is. Right? You walk into a place of yira, ilah, yira shleima, complete awe, you disappear. That's yira shleima. Hashem is so real to us. We and our foibles and our distractions and our temptations and our needs dissolve. So when a person is in Yerushalayim, when a person is in this incredible state of this intense awareness of Hashem at all times, where Hashem is so real and present that I feel I'm in His presence, no snake or scorpion can touch me. It's not possible. It's not that I have immunity when the negative thoughts come, I'll be able to fend them off. How could there be space for a negative thought? Everything dissolves. I only feel godliness. That's the message. And that's the aspiration of a Jewish person. And that's why the Mishnah here does not say it's a miracle reserved only for the Beis HaMikdash, but rather it is a miracle that extends into Yerushalayim, because it's an experience that every person can work to and Emet Hashem achieve. Okay? High aspiration, but aspiration nonetheless. How? There's the question. Okay? There is the big... That is what they call in the United States, they call that the $1 million question, yes? That's the question. How? How do we get there? So the reality is, like anything else in life, we have to train. Any of us who believes that it's just going to happen to us, one day we're going to wake up and we're going to have this amazing awareness, that's not possible. So we have to train ourselves. And in order to understand how to train ourselves, let's ask ourselves this. What is the healthiest way for a human being to behave? I'll give two options, just to make it easier, otherwise we'll be here all morning discussing the various possibilities. So here, two options of what's ideal for a human being, and let's see which we choose. Should we be led by our hearts, or should we be led by our minds? That's a Jewish answer, to say both, right? If let's say we have to choose one or the other, is it ideal that we are led by our hearts or by our minds? Okay, by our minds. Why do you say that with such confidence?
Because if we live by our minds, then it will actually go into their heart.
So if we're led by the mind will eventually feed into the heart and it will alter the direction of the heart. Okay, fine, fair enough. How do we know that the mind is still healthier, to be led by?
Passionate, and it wants to connect, and it wants to learn, and it
No,
wants to do what Hashem wants it to do.
Okay, so the mind is not naturally passionate, that's for sure. But the fact that the mind wants to do what Hashem wants, that is true. What do I mean by that? So there's a pasuk that says that Asher asa ha'elokim es ha'adam yashar. That Hashem made the human being, what's yashar? Straight, upright. Unlike animals, we spoke about this when we spoke about bowing in the Beis HaMikdash, right? The way Hashem structured our anatomy was to illustrate to us what the hierarchy of the human experience is. The fact that the brain is at the top is to indicate us that the hierarchy of the human experience is that the mind is the most developed part of being human.
And it's got the light.
I don't know what that means.
No, it means that if you have the will,
Right?
and that is on those levels of the different world,
Right.
you are the closest light. It's like that triangle.
Right.
That it starts off with the mind, and then it goes into the action, and then it goes into...
Fair enough. The only thing I'd be careful with is I wouldn't associate will with the mind. They're two different things. That's why we can talk about the fact that a person can have mind power and the fact that a person can have will power, and they're not identical. But that's subject for another conversation. The big difference between the mind and the heart is that the heart will always behave subjectively. And the mind has the ability to be objective. So therefore, if the mind understands the objective value of something, it can lead the heart to eventually feel subjectively that it's worthwhile. If the heart leads us to subjectively want something, it will drag the mind into trying to justify it, which is no longer objective. Okay, so why is that relevant to our conversation?
It's sort of Nase Vanishma type thing.
Nasa Vanishma is a little tricky because Nasa is not the mind.
Yeah.
Nishma is the mind. That's willpower.
And processing.
I'm saying, but Nasa is willpower and Nishma is mind power. That's why I wanted to distinguish between them. Okay, but for the purposes of our conversation, so what we need to do in order to get ourselves to experience even a fraction of Yira Shlema is we have to get our minds right. That's where it starts. So we're looking for a result that we feel in our heart because that's where Ahava and Yira play out, but it's not produced by our hearts, it's produced by our minds. So how do we get to Yira? We've got to exercise the mind. What does it mean, exercise the mind? So if we spend our time learning the practical side of Judaism, that's not the part that exercises our mind to help us feel for our Judaism. That's the part that exercises our minds to know what we're supposed to do. So we have to spend a decent amount of our time learning those parts of Torah that speak about Hashem to help us have a better appreciation of Hashem, because the more we appreciate Hashem, the more we'll be in awe of Hashem. That's the exercises, those are the exercises we need to do. We need to learn more about Hashem in order to expand our minds so that we'll get to Yira. Now here's the good news. You want to hear the good news? The good news is that for men, there is an incredibly important responsibility to learn the halachic side of Torah, to know how to practice. For women, the primary area of Torah learning is supposed to be to learn about character and about Hashem. So, a man has to toss up, how much Gemara do you have to learn in a day and how much Shulchan Aruch do you have to learn, and then how much Musar and Chassidus or whatever you're going to do in a day. Whereas for a woman, you don't have the same load of the Gemara and the Halacha, so women's Torah is supposed to specifically be in this area of developing our awareness of Hashem so that we have this Yira. So the short answer to the question is, the path to Yiras Hashem is learning about Hashem's greatness so that it comes into focus in our lives.
And can I just say also gratitude?
Gratitude will help us appreciate that Hashem is. It won't necessarily explain to us what Hashem is. And that's why we have to learn. We have to learn. There's no other shortcut. We have to learn about Hashem. Then we have an appreciation. Because unfortunately, I don't want to spend the rest of the lesson because I want to finish the Mishnah also. But unfortunately, what happens to us is we tend often to have generic understanding of things related to Hashem. We spend a lot of time delving into the detail of many areas of practice in Judaism, but we don't necessarily spend as much time delving into understanding Hashem. And according to the Rambam, that's the very first thing we're supposed to do, before anything else. Right? Yesoid ha-yesoidos, va'amud ha-chochmos. That's how he says it at the beginning of Mishnah Torah. The foundation of all foundations, and the root of all wisdom, leida, is to know sheyesh sham motzei rishon, that there is an original existence. Not leha'amin, to believe, but later to know it in our intellectual minds. The Rambam says that is the root and foundation of everything. And unfortunately, we don't give it enough time. So that would be our path to Yiras Hashem. Okay, let's wrap up the last part of the Mishnah. There are two possible ways to interpret this. The one is to say simply, nobody turned around and said all the Airbnbs were full, I couldn't go to Yerushalayim this year. Right? There was always space. The other side of it is, nobody said to his friend, it's inundated over here, Shalim Yerushalayim, how am I going to make money from the people coming to live in Yerushalayim for Yom Tov? Meaning to say, nobody ever felt that their parnasa was a threat because there were so many other people also doing the same thing, offering accommodation. The lesson there is, if you're close to the Beis HaMikdash, you remember where your parnasa comes from. You don't get misled. But here's another thing. You see, the fact that nobody felt that there was a lack of space, that's a really big deal, and that is a direct correlation to the miracle that happened in the Beis HaMikdash, that there was enough space for everybody when they had to bow. But when everybody stood in the Beis HaMikdash, and they stood crushed, and then they bowed, and there was enough room, the implication is that that miracle affected physical space, that the actual physical space expanded. When it says that nobody found it too congested in Yerushalayim, it doesn't say there was enough space. This is a different miracle. Yerushalayim did not expand. What changed was the attitude of people. Nobody said the lack of space is a problem. Different, right? In the Beis HaMikdash, the physical space expanded miraculously to accommodate everybody. And that had an influence over Yerushalayim, that in the space of Yerushalayim, people didn't feel they needed the same kind of luxury that they typically would have needed. You know, like I'm sure anybody who's ever run a Shabbaton or anything like that, we all know what happens when you get to the point that people book. I need a room like this, and I've got to have that much space, and it's got to face this way, and it needs to have a window. You know, it's not so simple. You just have a Shabbaton, everybody says, thank you so much, we appreciate you making a Shabbaton. You know, it's like everybody needs their thing. I've got to be on a ground floor, I need this, can't be too much noise. Here the miracle in Yerushalayim was that people didn't feel that they needed so much space. Why is that possible? Because the miracle of Yerushalayim was that they were so exposed to godliness that became what they cared about, at least while they were there. Maybe when they went home, they needed their big, multi-bedroom house or whatever. But in Yerushalayim, their orientation shifted completely to the point that they didn't feel a need for their own comforts. That's why he says, V'loi omar Adam lachaveiroi. There are various ways that the Torah describes human beings. Typically, we use the words enosh, gever, ish, and adam. Typically, when the Torah speaks about enosh, it's talking about the least developed human being. Ma enosh kisizkerenu. What's the point of considering humans? They're lowly. Gever, from the word gevura, that implies somebody who is working to overcome the challenges in their lives, including their own personality challenges. That's a gever. Baruch ha-gever, asher yiftach b'Hashem. Somebody who's working on their trust in Hashem. Ish is somebody who is a very developed person spiritually. That's why V'ha'ish Moshe is considered like a description for a great individual is Ish. But Adam is the ultimate state of personal development. And therefore the Torah tells us, for example, Adam Atem, that only Jewish people could be called Adam, nobody else. Because it represents somebody who could reach the highest level of spiritual development. That's the point. When the Mishnah uses the word chaveiro, it doesn't mean your friend, your Facebook friend. Adam lachaveiro means your peer, your contemporary, somebody who's in the same spiritual state that you are. So we're talking about two individuals over here who are highly developed individuals. And if they're highly developed individuals, obviously the main thing that they're going to care about when they go to Yerushalayim, the main thing that they'll care about is the spiritual experience. They don't care about the accommodation. We all know that. We have dozens of stories of our great people in our history. They couldn't care less what was on the menu, where they slept, made no difference. So this is Adam. Somebody's at that level. So there's no way that they're going to even feel the discomfort if there was any. The miracle is not only that they didn't feel the discomfort, there was no discomfort to talk of. They for sure weren't going to feel it themselves because they were at another level. But there wasn't even discomfort amongst the community to talk of. That means that ordinary people who weren't so elevated as they, by exposure to the great experience of the spirituality and holiness of the Beis HaMikdash, they also had none of their normal creature comforts or needs, and therefore the corollary, they didn't have any discomfort. Lesson for us, the lesson is this: a person cannot be passionate in two opposite directions. So the more passionate we become about spiritual things, the less bothered we become by physical things. They might even have an application in Joburg, by the way, that instead of worrying about an inverter, we should become a little bit more spiritual.